What makes an exceptional psychedelic guide? Do you think access to psychedelics should be as straightforward as obtaining a driver's license? And what do over 100 studies reveal about psychedelic use outside clinical settings? I'm Elena, and this is the integration session where we dive into the science, stories, and future of psychedelics. Today I'm joined by Dr. Mark Haden, a pioneer of psychedelic research, therapy, and drug policy reform. In this episode, we explore his recent findings on naturalistic psychedelic use, as well as his influential work in shaping psychedelic therapy training and his vision for a public health approach to psychedelics. Let's get started. Hello, Dr. Mark Haden, and welcome to the Integration Session podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
It is a pleasure to join your show.
Thank you. Well, you've been a leader in psychedelic research, practice, and policy for decades. So I would love to know a little bit more about your journey into this field. What first drew you to psychedelic research, and also what keeps you inspired today?
Well, curiously, it's in my blood. My dad was a psychiatrist, and in the 50s and 60s, he worked at the Kingston Psychiatric Hospital, and he was given LSD and psilocybin by the Sandoz Company after it had just been invented, because Albert Hofmann took his amazing bicycle ride, went back to his peers and said, "We have this new molecule that we've just invented." A number of them sat down and tried it and then discussed it, and they said, "This has something to do with psychiatry. We don't know what, but let's ask the psychiatrists." They were Sandoz, they made psychiatric medications. They sent it out to many psychiatrists around the planet and said, "What do you think?" And my father was one of them. And so he tried them and used them in this context with his colleagues at the Kingston Psychiatric Hospital. And he would talk about it at the dinner table. And he saw them as being useful tools. They were the first wave. They really didn't understand a lot of things. They didn't understand set and setting, and there were many details that were missing. But he saw them as being useful tools, and his enthusiasm was contagious. And I've had that in the back of my brain ever since. And when I worked for the Addiction Services, I ran a program for Vancouver Coastal Health Addiction Services for my main career, 28 years. And I was aware that we didn't have anything that was transformative for people. We had some fabulous staff. They were wildly enthusiastic and really good and talented and skilled and engaging. But nobody ever walked in our office and said, "Thank you, that was a transformative experience, I'm healed." And psychedelics have that potential. And I remember somehow the words ibogaine slipped out of my mouth to a client that I had who had really struggled, and he had not done well under my care and everybody else's care. And I'd known him for over a decade, and he was a heroin addict, and the word ibogaine slipped out of my mouth. He went down and had one ibogaine experience in Mexico and was transformed. He came back, and the person who I met in my office after that experience was a different person. His life changed. And he actually went on to, in fact, I still have some contact with his parents, which is interesting. But it was the shift of his life that he needed. And we did not have that tool. And when he experienced that tool, it was transformative. So I think all health services should explore how psychedelics can be helpful for their program, depending on what it is. Mm-hmm. And certainly mental health and addictions programs are poignant with the need for psychedelic medicines.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, I feel like a lot of times people see a transformative patient story and that's what really gets them inspired in the field. But that's so interesting that you have that familial link as well. I'm sure you had some interesting dinner conversations with your dad. That's really inspiring, and I'm sure he would be very proud of where you are today. So
yeah. I've taken the torch and I'm carrying it.
Exactly, yeah.
Running down the road and about to pass it off to you guys.
That's great. So you were chair of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies Canada, or MAPS Canada, for years, and developed the Manual for Psychedelic Guides. So I would love to talk about that a bit and your substantial role that you've had in psychedelic training and practice. So what are your current roles in this space, and how has that recently evolved?
Well, MAPS Canada was really important. I worked for Vancouver Coastal Health, and at that point in time, they changed, but at that point in time, they were not friendly to psychedelics. And I had endless debates with my managers and observed that we had an evidence-based program, and they weren't following the evidence. And that discussion went back and forth for quite a few years, and I realized that because I was in public quite a bit, I needed a hat that did not have Vancouver Coastal Health written on it when I was speaking about psychedelics publicly. So I knew Rick Doblin, who ran MAPS in the States, and he wanted MAPS Canada to exist, and I wanted MAPS Canada to exist. I wanted MAPS Canada to exist because I wanted to have something that was not Vancouver Coastal Health when I was speaking about it in public. He wanted MAPS Canada to exist because he wanted Canadians to write donations and get Canadian tax receipts. So I started MAPS Canada, ran it for 10 years, and then moved on into my variety of other roles. I run a ketamine clinic, and one of the things that we do that's quite interesting there is we give psychedelics to cops. We have a program called Helping Heroes, and specifically aimed at first responders. I think it's actually really important to give cops psychedelics, partly because having cops that are not traumatized means you have better policing, but also they're better at interacting with people that are under the influence of psychedelics, and they're fantastic advocates. Once they realize the benefits, having cops speaking about it publicly is incredibly helpful. One of our biggest advocates in the world of CHI, Integrated Health, which is the ketamine clinic I run, is an RCMP officer who was a veteran, and he was transformed in the experience, and he's a very loud advocate, and he's very, very effective because of who he is. So those folks are really good about talking about psychedelics, and effective and persuasive. When a cop speaks about the benefits of psychedelics, people tend to listen. I have many other jobs as well. I work with MAPS. I develop protocols for them. One of the things that I'm doing currently, have you ever heard of 3-MMC, 3-methylmethcathinone?
I think I heard about it briefly in a different podcast, but I don't know a ton about it, so I'd love to hear.
Well, I think it's a remarkable molecule. It was invented by a friend of mine. It's an empathogen, if you know the classifications of psychedelics, as the classics, the empathogens, and everything else. So it's an empathogen in the category of MDMA, MDA, and one can argue some other ones. But 3-MMC has empathogenic qualities and all of the advantages of MDMA, but none of the disadvantages. One of the disadvantages of MDMA is it's quite loving and emotional. And in a therapeutic context, it isn't helpful to have a loving bond with your therapist. So if MDMA is I love you, 3-MMC is this is who I am, who are you? So it's about insight and reflection and self-disclosure, but it doesn't have that other element that is quite touchy-feely and emotional. So it has all of the advantages of MDMA, but none of the disadvantages. So I actually am part of a company, it's called Therapeutic Adjuncts, that is developing 3-MMC as a molecule for therapy.
Very interesting. I want to go quickly back to the work that you've done with cops, because I think that's super interesting, and I haven't heard about that before. So what sort of unique challenges do you encounter? Because I imagine people that go into that profession are sort of a certain type of person, so I'm wondering if you have any interesting insight there.
Well, they're tough guys who don't reflect well and don't feel their feelings. And so it's very, very difficult for cops when they start to deal with PTSD, because that is not their sense of their self. Their sense of their self is they can handle everything, and they certainly can handle themselves, and they can handle their feelings, and they are invincible and vulnerable and immortal. And PTSD challenges that. And so they go off on sick leave, and they're actually quite challenging for their human resources department to work with. When you talk about the HR people that run cops on sick leave, it's actually quite difficult, because they also tend to have dominant personalities. They're required to have dominant personalities. That's part of policing. So it's complex offering them service, but it also is hugely rewarding, because the gap between their everyday experience of being the tough guy and very much in a very rigid cognitive and emotional box, and the experience of a psychedelic is so vast that the leap that they take with the experience results in a huge degree of enthusiasm and excitement when they realize that they can see the world in a different way and can approach their healing in a different way. So the healing can be quite rapid with them because of their boxedness. Is that a word? Probably isn't, but it should be.
Could be. Interesting. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I've never heard about that sort of population before, being a population of interest for psychedelics.
Yes.
And I want to know a little bit more from your guide on or manual for psychedelic guides. In your experience, what is sort of the characteristic of a effective psychedelic guide or therapist? So what are the sort of core competencies that you envision there?
So let me talk a bit about the guide itself and why I wrote it. Mm-hmm. Because in my world of MAPS Canada, I was in the podium quite a bit. I was talking about psychedelics very publicly at lots of conferences, and I sort of was a visible leader in the world of psychedelics. And so I, for some strange reason that caught me slightly off guard, I became the community complaints department. So when somebody had a problem with an underground therapist, who do you go to? And the answer, for some bizarre reason, turned out to be me. So I would listen to the complaint about the underground therapist, and then I would go and talk to the therapist, and I would listen to their perspective. And if I could see a solution, I would suggest some things. And I always thought it was better to, come to me than go to the police. So it just kept things out of the criminal justice system. And so I had a vested interest in trying to solve these problems. But what I became aware of as I did that is a lot of people who were underground therapists just didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know how to do the work. If they had followed the steps, if they had an understanding of the process and they had done it skillfully, there wouldn't have been a problem. And so I decided that the information, there's a lot of people who have written books about guiding, and they tell stories about what they experience when they're working with a client, but they never say what they do. This is how I set up a room. This is how I screen. This is how I assess. This is how I manage a session. This is how I provide integration services afterwards. The actual details of how to provide a psychedelic experience for somebody, nobody had ever offered that. And because I'm in this world, I decided to share that knowledge just to help everybody. And that was why I wrote it. And in it includes your question, which is what are the criteria for a successful psychedelic guide? What are we looking for? And that's a complicated question, so I won't answer it fully, but I will give you some clues. The first one comes from Janice Phelps' work. Janice Phelps runs CIIS in the States, and she's also a leader, and she wrote a paper of core competencies for psychedelic psychotherapists. And it's really quite interesting to look at her list. The first one is an empathetic, abiding presence. Let's look at that for a second. Empathetic means you can really resonate with what somebody else is experiencing. Abiding means you can do that for a long period of time, like 8 hours. You can stay connected and stay with somebody's experience and not get distracted by all the things in our brain and screens and everything else that distract us from being connected to a fellow human being. And the third word is presence, being present for somebody. So an empathetic, abiding presence. There's a lot in those three words, but that was the first competency. The second one was trust enhancement. How do you form trusting relationship? What does it mean to trust somebody? It means I don't believe that you will hurt me. So it's no harm will happen here, but it's also an ongoing sense of connection and understanding and support. So the trust is vital. Never share who you are with anybody that you don't trust. And psychedelics result in huge and intense trusting. The third one is spiritual intelligence. Ooh, that's an interesting one. What does that actually mean? It means you've been there. It means you understand what it's like to have spiritual experiences. Now, the best way to understand spiritual experiences is the MEQ, the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, which is used commonly in psychedelic research. And it's interesting just to look at some of the questions that the MEQ has. The experience of being pure and pure awareness beyond time and space. Wow. Experiencing of oneness, unity with ultimate reality. That's also a wow. Sense of sacredness or holiness. feelings of reverence, humility, and awe, certainty of encountering ultimate reality. I mean, if those words are kind of theoretical or meaningless, then you probably haven't taken a high dose of a psychedelic, and you're not going to be a good guide, because you won't understand it when people emerge from that experience and start using words that reflect that kind of experience. If you've been there, then it makes complete sense to you when people talk to you about spiritual experiences, and everybody uses different language, but you know what they're talking about and you can resonate with their experience. Another one is self-awareness and ethical integrity. So self-awareness means the psychedelic spaces are very intense, and they trigger us as guides. We get triggered in that. So are we aware of our own triggers and our own projections and aware of being in the world, that we can take responsibility for our piece of the pie, our puzzle, and our projections and our emotional vulnerabilities and our hooks that we get hooked to with other people when they're being intense. Psychedelic experiences are very intense. Sitting with people who are having very intense experiences requires a lot of insight, because you have to know what is going to happen for you and not projecting your issues on people as they have intense experiences. Transference and countertransference is another way of another language around that. It's all the same thing, is how do you manage other people's intensity and not get in the way of their issues. Knowledge of medicines, dosage and length of actions is really important. What medicines do you work with? Do you work with 5-MeO-DMT? What's the difference between 2 milligrams and 10 milligrams? If you don't know the answer to that question, you shouldn't be working with the medicine. So understanding the medicines deeply, and what are the benefits and harms, and how do they work. And then proficiency in complementary techniques. You know, people often come from a therapeutic background and they have a bag of tricks that they use, their skill set, and they can be used, but the context for the use of those other complementary techniques has to be understood. You know, you don't do cognitive behavioral work 3 hours after giving somebody 600 micrograms of LSD. You know, you use those techniques at the right time in the right place and skillfully in the context of psychedelic psychotherapy. So those are just the ones that Janice Phelps recommended. There's a lot more. In my book, I talk about red flags and green flags, and really understanding who is appropriate for psychedelic work and who is inappropriate for psychedelic work is crucial. If you don't screen and assess appropriately, you shouldn't be able to do the work. And if you don't understand things like personality disorders and the role that psychedelics can play with personality disorders, you really shouldn't be doing the work, because that will blow up on you big time. Mm-hmm. So things like, borderline personality disorder, it really requires a fairly detailed understanding of that particular personality disorder and how to work with those folks, and the relationship that has with trauma, and how resilience can play a role in that, and how that particular personality disorder has various levels of severity, and how a severe personality disorder person is quite different from a mild or moderate, especially if the mild or moderate have a high degree of resilience. So there's a lot of complexity to screening, and if you get it wrong, you have a big problem on your hands, and so that's really important.
Mm-hmm, certainly, yeah. It sounds like there's a lot of really critical insights in that guide, so I encourage anyone to check it out.
Yes.
And you mentioned it's very intense for the guide themselves, and especially with the empathy piece, they might be feeling that the same things as the person undergoing the experience. So do you recommend any sort of personal care for the guide themselves, or how is that addressed?
Oh, absolutely. The guide's resilience has to be strong. Mm-hmm. And so that involves, meditation is a crucial tool, because, it's a bit like being an airplane pilot. I'm not an airplane pilot, but my understanding of airplane pilots is they have two experiences. One is complete and absolute boredom where there's nothing going on, and the other is very, very intense situations that they have to deal with quickly and skillfully, and can be highly anxiety-provoking. So it's a bit the same. So you have to spend long period of times where somebody is internal. By internal, I mean they have eye shades on and headphones on, and they're lying there. They're not engaged with you at all. And you have to be there. You can't be on your phone. You can't be distracted. You have to be there during that period when people are internal. Meditation is a very, very important tool in that state. And then when people are external, which is mean they're now engaged with you, sometimes intensely engaged with you, then you have to be very, very calm. And you have to be able to understand what's going on and calmly reflect back in a very specific way, and use a whole variety of different tools to manage the intensity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned pilots. My partner's family is full of pilots, and I can really see their ability to stay calm and collected. But at the same time, there's sort of the need to always be in control of the situation. So I wonder how that would go in a psychedelic experience. I'm not too sure.
Well, the person in charge, the guide, has to be in control of the situation. Absolutely, in control in a way that it's about safety. The person who is the participant can't be running out in the street screaming. So you have to have control over the space. It has to be a safe environment. The participant is giving up control to the guide. You will control this space. It will be a safe space for me to be in for this period of time, and you need to be able to manage this. You're not, as me as the participant, you are not in control of me. In fact, there's a model that I think everybody should work with, which is the role of the guide is to honor and witness and support somebody else's internal healing intelligence. So that's a very simple thing to say, but it's a very hard thing to do. But the essential model is, if you think about if you have a cut or a scrape, and you're a child and you come to your mother, what does the mother do? You've got a bruise or a cut, let's say. So the mother puts on the Band-Aid, but the child heals the wound. The mother doesn't heal the cut. The mother is there, empathetic and supportive, and says, sorry you've cut yourself, and, this is what we're going to do. And she puts a Band-Aid on, and she's completely present for the child's pain. The child does the healing, or the child's body does the healing. That's a really useful model in the world of psychedelic psychotherapy. If you think you're the healer, we have a problem on our hands, because that's exactly the wrong position to take. If you fully understand that the healing is going to come from the participant, then you're in the right place. And people that think they're healers actually shouldn't be doing the work, because it becomes a huge problem, and it's very disempowering of clients, and actually can lead to places almost abusive.
Yeah.
So it's a huge distinction, and I talk about in my book who shouldn't be guides, and there are a number of people or types of people that actually shouldn't be doing the work, and understanding the power dynamics and how to manage that safe place is part of it.
Yeah, I love that analogy you gave with the Band-Aid and the mother. So that's sort of the dosing and the guiding of the psychedelic experience. But what about effective preparation and integration? What does that look like?
Those are crucial. And it's interesting. There's a lot involved with screening. There's a lot involved with preparation, and I can't cover it all, but I can cover some crucial pieces. And one of the absolute vital parts of it is accurately representing what can happen with both the benefits and the risks. So one of the things that happens is people who are going to be psychedelic guides become very enthusiastic, and they really believe that everybody will have a transformative experience. That's not true. In fact, a certain percentage of the people have transformative experiences. Some people have just it's a useful tool experiences, and some people have adverse events, and it doesn't work for them. So we have to prepare people for the range of different experiences people can have. So imagine for a second that you've been struggling with, let's say, depression for years, and you've been on every possible antidepressant, and it's really impacting your life. And then you hear about psychedelics, and you go to your psychedelic therapist, and they say, yes, you will be transformed by this experience, and then you're not transformed. What happens? If you were at risk for suicide initially, your risk for suicide has just gone up. because you've tried the big ultimate cure and it has not worked. So the therapist who has said, yes, you will be transformed, has actually done harm. In fact, you've done significant harm. You have to present it realistically to people. And saying this may not work for you is really, really important. And giving a context for that is crucial. So if that's probably the most important thing. It's a bit like, some people have magical thinking around psychedelics. So it's a bit like your car. When your car goes thunk, 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 what do? You take it to the garage and you talk to a mechanic and you say, it's going chunk, chunk, chunk. And you go away and you have lunch and you have whatever. You go away and you come back later. You don't need to know what the mechanic did. They just fix it. And if you have that model with psychedelic, that you're just going to put your brain into this psychedelic machine and retrieve your brain later, and your brain is going to be fixed, it's actually a huge problem. And so the model has to be, this is going to be a tool for you to use to understand who you are, and you can learn to work with the tool. And like all tools, it requires work. You don't just pick up a hammer or a skill saw or a table saw and know how to use it. You have to know how to use a hammer. You have to know how to use a saw. And you take time with the tool to learn how to work with it. Psychedelics are the same. They're tools. And it takes time to learn to work with them. And if you present them just as tools that you learn to work with, you're presenting a much more accurate and helpful message than if you're presenting them as magical wands that will fix you and transform you. So that's a crucial part of the preparation. And if you don't do that, you actually can do harm.
Yeah, certainly it's not a cure-all, not a magic fix, and requires a lot of work. So thank you for that. And I want to now turn to your recent paper in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies, which looked at naturalistic psychedelic use, so use outside of research or clinical settings. So why did you feel this was an important topic to focus on?
Well, it's interesting to look at our society and how we collectively, as North Americans and Europeans, whatever, think about drugs generally, and psychedelics are a drug. So what we do is we see them through the lens of prohibition. Now, that was a choice we made. We could see them, as indigenous cultures do, as powerful spiritual and healing tools. And we could have incorporated them into our society in a way that included, churches and healing centers, and we didn't. We chose a different route, and we chose the route of prohibition. Now, prohibition is one of the most massive failures of Western societies. It doesn't work. There's a huge number of research papers that have been written about, is this an effective way of managing things in our society? And the very simple answer, with hundreds, maybe even thousands, I don't know, but I certainly have hundreds of research papers saying it doesn't work. So we need to change it. We need to change how psychedelics are managed in our society. So if you think about cannabis for a second, cannabis, as you probably know, used to be criminalized in Canada. Prohibition was the tool, and it didn't work as a tool. A lot of people smoked it. And the process of change was an interesting one, because there's really two processes of legalization. One is the clinical trial research pathway, where you work with Health Canada to do clinical trials to eventually prove that it is healing, and then it's available through a doctor's prescription. That's one path of legalization. The path that cannabis went wasn't that. It was popular opinion. People, Justin Trudeau, who ran for PM of Canada a few years back, read the polls, and I think it was 62%. 62% of Canadians said they believed cannabis should be legalized. So he said, hey, 62%, I'm going to get in front of that. And he did very well. So I personally believe that was one of the main reasons why he succeeded. So public opinion is important with all drugs, and certainly with psychedelics, especially if your goal is access without having to go through this underground illegal process. And so if public opinion is important, let's inform the public as to what happened when people use psychedelics outside of clinical research settings. So the buzzword that researchers use is naturalistic use. Naturalistic use is basically when you take a psychedelic with your friends. But it's more than just that. It's with your friends, it's with your partners, it's with your families, it's with if you have a problem and you go to an underground therapist and they give you a psychedelic, again, that's outside of clinical research. So there's many different contexts. There's multi-day music festivals. That's often how people do psychedelics. So all of those are naturalistic use. And that's how most psychedelics are in society. Not much. What is it? 1% happens in clinical research labs, and 99%, I'm guessing what the numbers are, but most psychedelic use is naturalistic. So what happens when people use it naturalistically? And the paper explores, I think I found about 107 papers that were survey data or taking slices of existing databases, people who reported using psychedelics and other health or social issues. And the overwhelming conclusion is generally people get happier and healthier and less violence, and there are many health and social variables that are improved when people take them naturalistically. And so that's a really important piece of information for people to have, and it's especially important. I hired somebody to find emails for police officers and police departments and city councilors and mayors throughout Canada and up and down the west coast of the United States. And this person became wildly enthusiastic and came up with 800 emails. So I sent the paper out with the subject line, "Should mushroom stores be busted?" And then I attached the paper and I said, if you want to have a discussion about this, let's talk. And it's been fascinating because I've had tons of responses and I've only had one negative response. One person said, "You're wasting my time, please don't email me." But everybody else has said, "This is really interesting. I read your paper, wow." And so it may wind up influencing public policy around whether or not mushroom stores and psychedelic stores exist, because they're popping up across Canada and up and down the west coast of the United States. And they should be supported. And so here's the evidence that basically says leave them alone. If you want to have a healthier and happier and more productive and less violent society and less addicted society, you should let these stores just be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned the cannabis progression in terms of drug policy. Do you think that psychedelics will be following a similar route, or do you think we will have to wait until we get the clinical evidence?
Well, it all depends on public opinion and the percentage of people that support that. The Canadian Psychedelic Association did commissioned a poll that was representative of Canadian opinions. And the question that they asked that had the most support was should people who are dying have access to psilocybin mushrooms? And there was a vast majority of people who did. So I think that's kind of the thin edge of the wedge. So if we could, by a popular opinion, legalize that use, one of the truths of the human existence is we will all die. There's death and taxes. Those are the only two things we're absolutely guaranteed to experience. And so knowing that we have access to something that could be remarkable at the end of our lives may be helpful for people to encourage that use of them. And when you see your mother and your father and your aging friends or your palliative friends having those experiences, that is also a very compelling argument for wide legal access. Mm-hmm. If you can have a spiritual experience just before you die, maybe you should be able to have a spiritual experience in your mid-30s when you're doing just fine.
Certainly. Yeah, so I'm going to combine two questions here. So first, why do you think there are so many benefits of naturalistic psychedelic use? And second of all, you mentioned in the paper not only the benefits but also the risks. So I would love to know more about how you think the risks could be mitigated in some way, even if we are decriminalizing and then eventually legalizing psychedelics.
Sure. So why are there so many benefits? Now, that's a kind of a mechanism of action question. And the truth of the matter is we actually only ever speculate. With all drugs, there's often speculation of mechanism of action. Even things like SSRIs, there's that whole serotonin reuptake inhibitor model that anybody that's kind of involved with drugs can see that model. Even that's speculative. So we don't know, generally speaking, why any drug does anything. So, and you don't need to know. What you need to know to take a molecule and turn it into a medicine, you need to know that it's safe and that it's effective. And the mechanism of action is only something that people debate and wonder about. But nevertheless, I do have some speculation about why it is so effective for so many different health and social issues in our society. One is neuroplasticity. Psychedelics seem to increase the new brain networks can get formed. It appears when people are taking psychedelics. So if somebody's struggling with something, be it addictions or violence or depression, what they need is new neural networks. And this helps them develop new neural networks. That's one hypothesis. Another one is it enhances social connection. It can enhance social connection, especially the empathogens. So when you're really connected to people, they give you feedback. And if they give you feedback, you're more receptive to changing your behavior. Yes, I don't think you should be so violent. I think you have a problem with anger. And if you feel connected to the person who's telling you that, you're more likely to go off and deal with your anger. And violence, in order to be violent with somebody, you have to see them as very separate from yourself. And psychedelics tend to enhance connections, so you don't see people as different from you. And so how can you swing your fist at somebody that's actually kind of part of who you are? So fundamentally, psychedelics change your viewpoint of how you see other people. And it's also just an effective tool. It helps with insight and connection to a therapist, which are the main two reasons why therapy can be successful. So if you use them naturalistically under the guidance of a therapist, the therapy will probably be more effective. So those are three reasons that I speculate might be why they're so effective for so many different reasons. So the second part of your question was the risks. So one of the interesting things about the paper was the risks fell into sort of very clear categories, which was actually kind of interesting for me. When there were adverse events, people reported adverse events, they tended to be people who are of young age. So youth often don't know what they're doing, and they don't know how to manage a psychedelic experience skillfully. They don't have the maturity to do it, and they don't have the wisdom and knowledge and experience to do that. So youth was one issue. People who took out of control high dosages, so accidentally took high dosages, or didn't understand the dosage they were taking, and in retrospect said, "Hey, that was really, really strong." Or poor set and setting. So set is the expectation, and setting is the environment that you're taking it in, are really important. So that comes with knowledge and experience. You set up the experience, and you don't do it if you don't have the appropriate set. If you're not feeling that it's appropriate at that time, if the people in the room aren't appropriate for you to take them with, don't do it. So set and setting were determinants of challenges for people. And the last one was some mental health disorders, specifically bipolar or psychotic risk, and some personality disorders are people that can be really challenged by psychedelics. So there are some people with some mental health diagnoses that shouldn't take it. So that list is really interesting, because what it tells me is those are things that are manageable. How do you manage it? Well, if you have an appropriate way of regulating psychedelics in your society, and you have a young person who would like to do the experience, then you have mature, wise elders who guide the experience, and their younger folks are invited in and given appropriate preparation and screening and allowed to have the experience. So the sharing of information between wise experienced elders, and younger folks is just one answer to the challenges that people offer when they have psychedelic experiences that go wrong.
Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned in your paper a public health framework and how that could look for psychedelics, involving both indigenous practices and then also contemporary Western protocols. So how do you think clinical training programs should adapt to sort of incorporate both of those pieces into psychedelic therapy?
Well, I have two answers to that. So one is, I actually wrote a paper on how I believe psychedelics should be legalized, and it's on my website. You can go download them for free. So I think I do propose a certain model, and the model has two tracks. The track number one is paid professionals. So our society should allow people to offer psychedelic experiences to others. Now, the context of offering it to others doesn't really matter. It could be indigenous peyote ceremonies, it can be ayahuasca ceremonies, it can be PTSD therapy, or it could be multi-day dance festivals. It doesn't matter. But the crucial criteria are you're a paid professional, you are a licensed paid professional, so that means people can complain about what you do if you don't do it skillfully, and there's an oversight body that will deal with complaints. So only skilled people would be allowed to do it, and so they should be trained as psychedelic supervisors or guides, and they should be revoked if they don't do it skillfully and people aren't happy with the service. And they should be paid for the service. That's kind of track number one. And I offered that thought at many different conferences, and I would always get somebody at the back standing up and yelling at me. And they would say, I don't agree. And I'd say, oh, talk to me, tell me why. And the answer was, I love psychedelics, and what I do with my partner when I'm under the influence of a psychedelic, I do not want supervised. So, okay, I understand that. So I came up with a second track. And the second track was people should be able to access psychedelics for use outside of all the things that I just mentioned. But they should have some training. So in my world, you'd be trained for 2 weekends. The first weekend is knowledge. What is 600 mics of LSD going to do to you? What does set mean? What does setting mean? What is an appropriate, should you drive a car under the influence of a psychedelic, and how long should you wait before you drive a car? So basic knowledge about psychedelics is the first weekend. The second weekend is an experience by a wise experienced elder who can show you about how it's done skillfully. And then you should be able to pass a test. And the test should not be that complicated. What's 10 milligrams of 5-MeO DMT smoked? What's that going to do to you? If you don't know the answer to that question, you shouldn't be taking 10 milligrams of 5-MeO DMT. So if you pass the test, then you should get a license, and you should be able to purchase psychedelics at your local, I like the word apothecary, but whatever, the store that sells psychedelics, because you've demonstrated that you have enough knowledge to do it, and that's basically naturalistic use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like that model, and I've sort of heard the analogy of getting your driver's license. So you go, you don't just allow anyone to drive a car. You have to be a certain age. You have to have the knowledge you need in order to do it safely and keep others safe. And I really like that.
Yeah, exactly. Same thing. Mm-hmm. And the second piece of what you said is actually kind of interesting. So, and this is a tiny little piece, but I find it an interesting piece. Many people go down to Peru and have an ayahuasca experience, and they have it, and they have wonderful experiences and transformative experiences. They come back, and then you say, did you speak with the shaman? And the answer is, well, actually, the shaman didn't speak English. And so that's a curious one. So they communicated with the shaman, but they didn't use language. So what's the vehicle for communication with the shaman is music. So it's curious how often words go wrong in psychedelic space, and egos get into place, and I'm the healer, I'm going to therapize you, and that can become actually a huge problem in psychedelic space. And the idea that we don't even share the same language, but we do share the language of music, is a really helpful way of understanding indigenous use. And if people realize that they can communicate without using words, and how they do that is music, it is really, really helpful, because it actually sidesteps some of the really big problems that happen in psychedelic space when, people who really believe they're healers and they're going to do their thing with somebody under the influence of a psychedelic, is actually a huge problem. And you sidestep that problem completely when you communicate with music. You don't have those ego problems that can get in the way of the healing process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so do you mean creating music, or the music you select for the experience, or how can that look?
Either one. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter how you work with music, but you're communicating with the music. You create your own, or you're using whatever, Spotify, it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. But you're a DJ. Does a DJ play their own music? Nah, not really. They usually bring canned music. But you can be a live musician, or you can be a DJ. But if you understand that this is the healing, this is the message that I'm sending somebody. It's not me. I'm not talking. My ego is not part of this. Mm-hmm. And so I don't see myself as being the great healer. People who see themselves as being great healers are actually a big problem in psychedelic space.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
It's very disempowering for clients. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We need to find ways of empowering the clients and not empowering the therapists.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as we get sort of more towards the end of the conversation, I would love to extend it to a more societal level. So you've often spoken about the transformative potential of psychedelics, not just for individuals, but also for society on a larger scale. So where do you see that happening in sort of the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, if I think about the steps, The steps are, I mean, there's a massive number of clinical trials in process, and I'm part of that. So the clinical trial research process is ongoing. And if you want to know how many, you go into clinicaltrials.gov. It's a website where all clinical trials get registered, and you plug, it's very easy to search that database. And you can search for psilocybin, MDMA, psychedelics generally, and what you see is there are hundreds of clinical trials going on. And so that engine, that massive train going down the track of clinical research will manifest in psychedelics being available through the prescription pad. So that's with the use, and in order to do a clinical trial, that's not true. In order to turn it into a medicine, you need a diagnosis. So the narrow box of having a diagnosis is what most clinical trials are looking at. We need to get beyond diagnosis because psychedelics are useful beyond just simply treating depression, anxiety, PTSD, etc. So the next round is actually healing stuff that isn't a diagnosis. So couples conflict is a good example, family conflict. And helping families and couples to heal is probably the next step because it's still seen as healing, but it's not associated with a diagnosis. Couples conflict is not in the DSM. Mm-hmm. So still seeing them as healing vehicles, but outside of diagnosis is the next step. And then spirituality. You know, there's tons of work that's being done looking at these as spiritual tools. It'd be really nice if some of the existing churches and religious traditions adopted psychedelics within their contexts. You know, I read an article recently saying there's a lot of churches that are going bankrupt throughout North America. And there's these beautiful buildings that are now sitting there not being used. I can think of a way invigorating congregations and getting people back into those churches. And I don't think there's a religious tradition that can't be enlivened with the use of psychedelics. And so I think that's kind of on the scale. You know, the beginning is psychedelics for existing diagnoses, and then it's sort of healing in a larger context. And then how do we bring spiritual traditions and psychedelics together is kind of my end goal.
Yeah, sounds like a beautiful future. And if you had to leave our listeners with one final thought about psychedelics or one thing they could take away from this conversation about psychedelics or the future of public health, what would it be? Be
realistic with what psychedelics can offer. Often people who are involved with this field can be evangelical and wildly optimistic, and that actually can produce a backlash. So when talking about psychedelics, talk about them using evidence. Cautious use reflecting on evidence is exactly the way to talk about psychedelics. Over evangelizing them actually can produce a backlash. So focus on the science, focus on the facts, publish forever on them, and see their benefit as well as their risks, and stay focused on the science.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you so much, and thanks for joining me today. It was truly a pleasure.
Thank you, Elena.
Yeah, I feel like I learned a lot.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much for joining me for this lovely conversation with Dr. Mark Haden. I'd like to thank the Center for Psychedelics, Health and Research at Queen's University and the support of our sponsors at the Ontario Brain Institute, the Canadian Biomarker Integration Network in Depression, and Providence Care Hospital. Until next time, be well and integrate wisely.